Welcome to the Life's Best Medicine podcast, where we are finding hope and healing one episode at a time. No appointment needed, no rubber gloves, and no coping. Just a healthy dose of life lessons to help equip you for this wild journey we call life. Oh boy, it's November. Guess what? Christmas is coming up, the holidays. Oh boy, this is the tough month, right? So, some of us might have got knocked off track a little bit on Halloween, but let's be as good as we can this month. Try to enjoy yourself, enjoy some Simply Snacking. They're hosting this podcast. So, try out the beef and chicken flavors. It's a great option for you to have if you're traveling to see family. It'll keep you sane in the airport and you won't have to eat the airport food. So do what I do, have some Simply Snacking, beef and chicken, tons of flavors. Go to their website, check them out. And thank you for listening. Hey everyone, this is a friendly reminder that we are here for entertainment purposes only. We may not even be that entertaining at times, but this is not medical advice. Talk to your doctor, check with your healthcare professionals before making any lifestyle changes or medicine changes. What we're talking about is our clinical experience and what we've seen. And so if you really want our advice, you can consult us. You can actually consult me as a doctor, or you can consult my guest and get all your questions answered. But we can't give free medical advice because we can't pay our bills with that, but we can help to educate you a bit and allow you to think a little bit. And always reach out to your medical professional before making any lifestyle changes. Thank you. Hello and welcome to the Life's Best Medicine podcast. This is actually a very challenging one for me. I was just here trying to hit record, not record, hit record, not record. Like when you have to make a phone call and talk to someone, that you want to go out on a date with, and they're out of your class, or trying to get that job that you've been waiting for forever. That nervousness where you say, "Gosh, I have to answer hard questions, or maybe share myself." I started this podcast to provide a platform for people who have overcome a lot in life, people who've faced adversity, people who've been through a lot, and so I'm going to answer a question that a friend of mine asked, which is a really difficult question to answer. He said, "Brian, what is your identity? What do you identify as?" And it's funny because that is such a topic now. We're all worried about our pronouns and how we're viewed in the world. We're living in a world of Instagram, where everyone has a perfect life, and Facebook, and then everything's great. They're going on vacation every day and you find out they end up divorced or, broke up, or you realize life's not as great as they had depicted it to be. And I've always prided myself on just being real and authentic and really not really worrying about what people think for the most part. But I also do care what people think. I'm human, and you want people to like you and respect you and trust your integrity. So that's a hard question of what do you identify as? Because I've heard so many people misclassify what I identify as. So I figured the best thing to do is just tell you, here's how I see it. And the hard part about it is when I look back on my life, I've identified as a lot of things. And I think a lot of you can identify with me on this. I was thinking, okay, when I was a kid, I identified as a son, as a brother, as a friend. You'd identify as a student as you're going through school. And then as life goes on, we start having new identities. As a kid, I identified as a Pittsburgh Steelers fan for some reason. I think it's because they kept winning Super Bowls and they all had a bunch of rings on their fingers. And then I transitioned over to being a Raiders fan when I lived in LA. And then I was a Chargers fan here in San Diego. Now we're teamless. And actually, the NFL has lost its glimmer for me. It doesn't bring me the excitement that it used to. So now I don't really identify as that, as a huge football fan. I played football growing up. I identified as a football player all growing up and through high school, and it brought me a ton of blessings. I identified as a team captain a few times. I identified as a team leader, as the small guy who wasn't supposed to play, but then started as a junior. I was blessed in a lot of ways. And in high school, kind of the quiet guy, overweight kid, developed
wrestled. I never really identified as a wrestler as my identity, but I did, and starved myself and worked out hard and tried my hardest and never got pinned. In football, I never got a penalty against me. I tried to follow the rules. I'm a rule follower. Uh, I'm not a rebel. I identified as a student, as a scholar athlete, and then I go to college, and you're just another person that you have to work really hard now. No one really knows who you are. They didn't. You don't get to wear your jersey on Friday, so everyone at the school knows you're cool and you've arrived. Um, I identified as an anteater at Irvine, UC Irvine, and biology major. Worked hard there. Um, identified as a hard worker who studied hard and knew I was working hard to get to where I would want to be. Then I graduated cum laude from UC Irvine, which is in the top whatever percent. And I applied to med school after doing research and all that. And then I identified as someone who didn't get into med school on the West Coast, and I then identified as a person who didn't want to move to Chicago or New York. And so I took a gap year and did research, and I worked. And then I identified as a person applying to med school and taking the MCAT and all that kind of stuff. Then I get accepted to med school, and now I identify as a medical student. And you're at the bottom of the rung. You have the short coat. You're not really accepted yet, and you have to work all the way through that. So I always identified as not the smartest guy, but a hard worker. And I developed skills of compassion and loving people and all that. So I identified as a med student. Then I identified as a medical graduate. Then I identified as a resident or an intern first, and then a resident. So it's funny how our identities can change over time. So I began identifying as a husband when I got married, and then as a father, juggling kids and marriage and working hard and all those things. Identified as American, as patriotic. I've identified as a Christian, through life events and how things go. Okay, I grew up non-Christian, and then something happened. Life happened, and I had to really reassess what mattered. Identify as a kid from a broken home with two parents who loved me, mental illness in my family, diabetes, obesity, hypertension, all these things. And so then I identified as a intern resident, then chief resident, staying on it a year. And ultimately, what do you really identify as? I identify as a good friend, as someone who's compassionate, as someone who cares about other people. And then obviously as a husband, as a father, then as a partner in a practice. And then I identified as someone who underwent an embezzlement in my old practice. And that financial security I worked so hard to get, from struggling, in med school and not having anything, to having a little bit of financial security, then realizing you're not going to get a paycheck for a little while. Then I identified as a person who really depended on my friends to support me in that time. And then I identify as a guy who worked really hard for 18 years in practice, trying to prove myself and prove that, I could do it. And then I realized that wasn't my identity. My identity wasn't as the hardest worker, sleeping the least of anyone, having the least downtime, the least vacations. That's not what I wanted to identify as anymore. So in reality, then I became a direct primary care doctor. I also identified as a podcast host with Tro Kalasian and Jason Fung. I've had the blessing of interviewing some of the greatest minds, some of the greatest people ever. And hopefully you can go back and listen to some of those episodes. And all those things started to shape me. But ultimately, what do I identify as? As a great husband? Yeah, I do. I mean, and then I start looking at all these things, and I realized all these things I've identified as, I've blown it over the years. I've lost compassion for people. I've been frustrated. There's certain people I just don't have grace for. Certain people bother me. Certain things in my job I don't like. I do get annoyed sometimes when I get called in the middle of the night and it's not an emergency. Little things like that where you say, gosh, I would love to say that I'm perfect and that I have compassion for everyone. I identify as a low carb doc, and that's not my identity necessarily. And so over time, especially in recent months, I've identified as a Californian, and now I say, do I really identify as a Californian? I'm kind of out of my league here. I might have different views. And so ultimately what matters, even doing this podcast, I've heard so many great stories. People have faced death and, life adversity, losing a spouse, cancers, all these things. And then I watched friends of mine like Ivor Cummins, uh, uh, Professor Noakes, Gary Fettke, like step up, and they knew what they were doing wasn't popular. So it's like, do I identify as a person who really needs public approval? Do I need everyone to say, yeah, you're the greatest guy on earth and you're doing great things? I've identified as a medical missionary. I forgot that part of it, but that was never really my identity. It was just something I felt like I wanted to do. And so then I think if I can blow it at all these things and have bad days and lose compassion and lose my drive, lose my hope, lose my faith a little bit, and when you start seeing dark days and getting locked down and seeing the impact on people, you start really questioning what you believe, and for me, uh, I've never been an activist. I've never been someone who goes into the fight. I've never been at a protest. Uh, but you realize, gosh, we can't just let people run over us at some point. At some point, you have to stand up for what you truly believe. You may be wrong, but at least you have to stand up and say, gosh, this is not how I see it. And I look back at the Bible of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. They said, bow down to the golden statue, or we're going to throw you in the fire. And they said, okay, throw us in the fire, right? Because they weren't going to bow down to what everyone else believed. And then I think, am I that person, or do I just want to go along, get along, be quiet, fly under the radar, just kind of stay out of the spotlight? And it's a hard thing. So I've had to really reassess, like, okay, if California believes that you are spreading misinformation intentionally or unintentionally, why don't they take your license? So I'm licensed in Arizona also. Why don't you have to leave your home? Why don't you leave your friends and neighbors and friends and family and church and all these things that you've established? I think, well, I've done it before, And so the question is, how much do we stand up, lose our platform, and not be able to help anyone? So I think a lot of us have been walking that tightrope of saying, okay, how do I do the greatest good without really stepping over that boundary? How do I use analogies? And, maybe that's why Jesus used so many, parables, because he could say something without actually saying it, And so a lot of us are smart enough, especially my listeners are smart enough to say, hey, there's obviously more to the story. But I think the point is, sometimes we're used when we're imperfect. So ultimately what I had to think is, okay, what do I really identify as? Because my identity has really changed. So if I couldn't be a doctor anymore, do I have no identity? No, I have a lot of other identities. But ultimately what I realized is all of my identities have flown out of my real identity of being a son of God, right? I believe that. And I believe God has my back, and that God wants us to do the right thing and to love our neighbor and to have grace and to be at peace and not to judge. And, we've all failed at all those things. But the more I look at it, I realize, man, you kind of try your hardest. And I think the more plugged in we are to good people, to positivity and having hope, we just do better at that, and so I think that's been my struggle. It's been amazing, actually, like, saying positive things, and people really try to misconstrue what you say. If you say, there's a quote by Martin Luther King, for instance, they'll say, well, he, cheated on his wife and all these. Well, I'm quoting the quote. That the quote is what I'm saying, and that gives me something, because none of us are perfect. And my wife will be very glad to tell you all of my imperfections. She's very good at picking them out and seeing them. But the point is, we all have imperfections, and sometimes we have to, look past that and realize that, I'm wearing a t-shirt right now, and I'm not dressed up, and I'm not wearing a suit, and I'm not in a fancy office. But that's life, and I think so many of us have unrealistic expectations of how life should be, and that we're the center of the universe and everyone has to bow to us. And so, I think that's really important for all of us to really look and look at the deeper layers and say, who are you? What matters to you? Do you love the underdog? Do you love Rocky? Do you love those kind of movies? And you really want to reach out and help people. Do you want to fly under the radar? Is security the most important thing to you? Is having the most followers on Twitter or Instagram the most important thing to you? Or is it important to be real and share with people your struggles and what's happening in life? And so many times I've met people and they're like, "Oh, it's such an honor to meet you." People in the low carb community, and it's like, "Hey, look, I'm struggling. I'm still trying to lose weight. I'm still trying to get my workouts right. I'm trying to deal with life stress and deal with, uh, you know, com- having compassion for all people and all those things." So it's funny how there's this perception of people until you really meet them. But I'll tell you, so many of these people that I've met that have been attacked mercilessly, like Asim Alatra, you know, Gary Fetke, Tim Noakes, Tro, all these people, they're decent people. They want to go home and have a good life and hopefully make a positive impact on the world. And it's funny because when people find out I'm Christian, they'll say, "Well, you always give the examples of people who kind of had the odds against them and they made it, but David and Goliath type stories. But what about all those ones who didn't make it?" I said, "Yeah, that's for me. That's what convinced me of biblical truth was when all the apostles came out, and in the book they're losers. They had fear. They and this is kind of what I'm saying too. It's like we're flawed. We're not perfect. I can't prove all this stuff to you. But the point is that they didn't make it, that they were holier than thou and that they didn't have struggles. And if you read what they said, it's really amazing about the struggles these people had. And they were in the presence of God, right? And they still didn't believe and they still had no hope for 3 days, but on the third day, they had hope again, right? Um, so these are the things that drive me. I think that again is my identity. That's it. It's not popular. If you're a person of faith these days, it's really not popular. It's funny because it's considered hocus pocus or that we're living in some kind of fantasy world. But the people who know, they know. If you look at longevity studies, if you just look at that, people of faith live longer. And again, the other thing I really, it's really a hard thing, and I've always taken offense to when people say you're intolerant. It is very funny because if you listen to this podcast back to all the other episodes, we've had people of all different faiths, people of different sexual preference, people of whatever, different races. And it's like when we refuse to judge people based on those things and see them as a person and what they contribute, then life gets a lot better. So maybe that's the message for you here. Maybe it's just saying, hey, look, we're going to have a difference of opinion, but I don't believe in all this Jesus stuff. That's okay. But maybe there's other things you can take from that. One of my favorite episodes so far was Guy in Austin. He's atheist, left leaning. I'm Christian, right leaning. And it was one of my favorite discussions because we kind of see things, we see the world in the same way. We may have different solutions to it, but we see the world in the same way. And we see corruption and we see that there should be justice for people who've suffered. And I think over time we've had so much, we've been exposed to so much that we've lost that sense of community. And Twitter's had some changes lately, and it's kind of funny the positivity that I'm seeing that I wasn't seeing before. Because if we're constantly bombarded with negativity and depressing things, and that the world's going to end, and the ozone layer is going to, there's a hole in the ozone layer, and there's acid rain, and all this stuff, there's gloom and doom stuff. We're all still here. We just went through a huge pandemic, and we're all still here. Those of us are listening. Not everyone makes it, but we do our best to make the best of it. To protect other people and to try to do the right thing. So hopefully that's how you see this podcast in general with the guests that I've had on. But I think that the question is, what do you value? What do you identify as? What really matters? Because some of those things can be taken from us very quickly. We could lose a spouse very quickly, or you lose a child, or you lose your job, lose your house, you lose your fancy car. Then what? Right? So I love people who say, "I'll just make it back again. I'll dig up from the ashes." And so I think we need more stories like that. So and the other thing is that's broken my heart really. And the reason this came up actually was my good friend Greg Monk, is he wrote a book called The Guide, and he has some sermons talking about um, what do you do, like being in the military and how his life changed, and being the guide where you had to stand up for everything. And I'll tell this story just in brief, but this guy is a guy who struggled with alcohol in high school, and I was the one who kind of kept him in line and helped him out. And he was doing all the wrong stuff, I was doing the right stuff, even though I wasn't a Christian guy growing up. And then over time, he goes to the military. He goes in to basic training and realizes he has to get his life together. And so he goes from a kind of a screw up type guy, drinking every night, and all that kind of stuff, to the platoon leader, the guide. And the guide is in charge of the flag. So what happens is, and as it happens in life, you go through and the guide he's in control of all of his men under him. And so if someone messes up under you, the guide takes the brunt of it. So if someone doesn't do the push-up right, the guide is going to have to do push-up. So basically, you want your people to really be in line, and they have your back, and you have to have their back in return. So one day, and he thinks it was set up, but the drill sergeants, everything they did was wrong. They're doing push-ups and running instead of, and just getting cussed at and screamed at, and says, "You're the worst platoon. You're an embarrassment to the Marines. I can't believe I have to deal with you guys." All this stuff. And so they said that the flag, like he was saying, as the guide, you carry the flag of that platoon. I think it was 2205, if I remember right. And so that flag represents your platoon. And you carry it, you sleep with it, you have it with you, and you're the leader of that platoon. So that day, that his drilling sergeants were screaming, and they say, "You guys are the worst guys." That they made him unblouse and basically going from higher rank to lower rank, and looking like a newbie when they had been struggling all this time. And the platoon leader grabbed the drill instructor, grabbed the flag, broke it in half, threw it on the ground, said, "You guys don't deserve to be in the military," and he told Greg, the platoon leader, to the guide, to lay down next to the flag, and he told every guy in the platoon to spit on the flag. And he had to lay there, and the spit of all these guys is going on his face, and he was filled with rage and so mad, because he had worked so hard for all this stuff, and he knew that they were with the best platoon out there. So over and over, the guys went by, his own guys spit on his face, basically, right? Spitting on the flag that he was commanded to protect, And so at the end, the platoon, only two guys in the platoon wouldn't spit on the flag, and they stood him up and they told him to spit on the flag. And he said, "I won't do it, sir." He said, "This is a direct order." He said, "I will not spit on the flag." So they kept going back and forth, screaming at each other, and they knocked him to his knees in front of the flag and ordered him. They were holding his head down over the flag, and they had him doing push-ups and sit-ups and all this stuff. And he said, "I will not spit on the flag." And ultimately, the platoon leader grabbed him by the front of his jacket, lifted him up, and said, "That's why you're the platoon leader, because you know what matters, and you know what you were told." And so those things, and you stand for your convictions, and you don't just bow down because everyone else is doing it. That's why you're the platoon leader. And I think there's a message in that for all of us. That people may not like you, they may not agree with your opinion, they may say there's things that aren't true, that when you say, well, this kind of is true. For me, I mean, one thing that came up is I believe all lives matter. I do. Some people get upset with that. Do I believe Black lives matter? Absolutely. Asian lives, Hispanic lives, homosexual lives, white lives, I think they all matter. How could this possibly be controversial, right? I'm a doctor. I'm called to take care of that person in front of me, whether I agree with their political stance, whether I agree with the religion. I don't care. All that stuff, it's the patient in front of me. So I think a lot of us have lost that, because people are telling us what we should believe and what we should not believe. And it's okay to not believe something. You may say whatever, lives don't matter, but I will never agree to that. I agree baby lives matter. I agree old lives matter. I agree in the sanctity of life. So that's just me. That's what I believe. And so it's always a struggle when everyone else sees the world a different way. And I think that's part of this too, is being able to say, I kind of don't see it that way. When we have community, we're going to find like-minded people who say, look, I refuse to judge people based on race. right? Again, going back to Martin Luther King, that we should judge people by the content of their character and how they treat people and what kind of citizen they are, not because of other things, and separate ourselves. And the other thing is, you think about it. Someone tweeted something today, and I was thinking, it kind of struck in my brain, and I didn't respond to it, but I was thinking about it today. He was basically saying we've always divided ourselves based on different characteristics. For instance, my answer would be, if I'm in Vietnam and I see a guy speaking English, I'm going to be attracted to that person because they're speaking English. That's something I'm comfortable with and something I know. Or if I'm in Germany and I see someone wearing a Padres shirt, it's like, oh, you're a Padres fan too. So am I, right? There's so many things, or a certain religion or a certain complexion, whatever it is, you're drawn to those people. It's natural. There's nothing wrong with that. But the point is, you have to respect people of all cultures. And what I love is going to different places and seeing, oh, that's how you guys do it. That's kind of cool. Like, oh, your religion believes that. That's kind of cool. So I think if we can just take a part of each of us and say, hey, I like that part. I don't agree with everything, but I agree with that part of it. So I'm not going to try to silence you and censor you. I want to hear what you have to say. And then, when we have enough people of common sense, then we can come to some kind of a conclusion. So I think that in the final analysis, I think the question of what is your identity is really, really critical to what we're doing in life. So what is your identity? Is it the CEO, being the CEO of the company someday? Is your identity, being the nicest person on earth and never having conflict? Is it, being the leader in times of trouble? Is it just kind of sitting in the middle of the pack and never getting singled out? We all have different views of that, but I think for each of us individually, it's really important to say, well, am I a leader? Am I a follower? Do I believe these, and can I change my identity? I think so. I think we can change our identity over time and saying, here's what I identify as. But for me, I have to say, here's my underlying identity. And all my other identities fall apart. And unless I say, okay, I'm a child of God, and I'm going to try to have all these other things as an outflowing of that. So that's my long answer. Sorry to go on this tirade, but I think it's important to know who you're listening to. And I don't want to have hidden agendas or say something that's, just because it's a popular belief and I want to fit in and be the cool kid. I'm getting older and I really don't care about that. I have a ton of good friends, people who love me. And, I think life is exciting. And sometimes saying, okay, we're living a little bit on the edge. Let's see what happens. And, certain turn of events and your entire life changes. I mean, I hear stories like that all the time. One encounter and your entire life changes. So hopefully you could be that conduit. You could be out there and lift up someone and help them out. And the reason I brought up the guide story, by the way, is because we have a massive problem with, military suicides, that doctor suicide, nurses suicides. I mean, suicides, it's a horrible thing, but it's really like we get to that point of no hope, where we have no identity anymore. We have nothing that we're striving for. We have nothing that gets us out of bed. We have too much pain and not enough pleasure or happiness or hope, really. So I think, providing a little spark of hope for someone and saying, you're good at this, you're a good kid, or whatever it is, being positive, and uplifting people. I think that's one of my identities too. I hope to be, reasonable and say, yeah, I don't like you, but you lost 58 pounds. Cool. That's awesome. Right. That's all good. But instead we look for the flaws in each other. And we're really, really good at seeing the flaws in each other and not seeing ourselves. The scripture about taking the plank out of your eye so you can get the splinter out of your neighbor's. That's something that we can all agree on, even if you don't believe in my crazy Christian book stuff. So everyone, I hope this makes sense to you. And it does make me nervous to talk about it in a way, but I think it's important for people to know where I come from. And so be kind to me, but really be kind to yourself, be kind to others. And, thank you for listening. And I hope this triggers something in you to really sit back, because a lot of us think we know who we are, but who are we really? Who are you? What gets you ticking? What gets you out of bed in the morning? What gets you motivated? And I hope to bring more stories of people that are doing great things. And I heard some great stories today, so I'm really excited to get you some more stuff. And you won't have to hear me go on a little tirade here. So blessings. Have a great week. Thank you for listening to this episode. We greatly appreciate your support. We would greatly appreciate a positive thumbs up on all of the platforms like iTunes and
Spotify or wherever you're listening. And we just thank you for our Patreon supporters. We greatly appreciate your help in getting this message out. We think there's a lot of important information, and hopefully this helps you. Have a great day, and thank you for listening, and thank you for your support.